5 queens who ruled the world. Picture this. A one-eyed African queen captures Roman soldiers, beheads statues of Caesar Augustus, and buries his bronze head under temple steps so her people can walk over his face for eternity. That head is now in the British Museum. They don't mention that part. Her name was Amanirenas, and she's one of 5 African queens whose empires were so powerful, so wealthy, so threatening to the narrative you were taught, that history tried to bury them completely. This is their story. The lie you were taught. Pop quiz. Name 5 Roman emperors. Easy, right? Now name 1 Nubian queen. Exactly. Here's what they don't tell you in school. While tribal villages dotted the European landscape, African queens were already commanding armies of 30,000, building architectural marvels, and controlling trade routes that connected 3 continents. These weren't ceremonial figureheads wearing crowns for photo ops. These were military generals who led from the front lines, economic masterminds who controlled resources that made kingdoms rich beyond measure. Rulers so powerful that when Europeans finally arrived centuries later, they literally couldn't believe black people had created what they were seeing. So they lied. They didn't just conquer Africa. They waged war on African memory itself. They burned libraries, melted golden artifacts, demolished temples. When they found archaeological evidence they couldn't destroy, they simply declared that Africans couldn't possibly have built something so sophisticated. It must have been foreigners. Anyone else. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Because if you're going to enslave millions of people, if you're going to extract wealth from an entire continent for centuries, you need a story that justifies it. You need everyone to believe you're bringing civilization to savagery. And so the lie became curriculum. But the truth survived. Queen Makeda, the woman who tested Solomon. Almost 3,000 years ago, a queen ruled a kingdom spanning modern-day Ethiopia and Yemen. Her name was Makeda, though you might know her as the Queen of Sheba. She controlled frankincense and myrrh. If you've only heard those words in Christmas carols, understand this. In the ancient world, these resins were worth more than gold. Controlling the frankincense trade was like controlling oil today. The Bible tells a story about her visiting King Solomon. She heard about his wisdom and decided to test him, bringing gifts of spices, gold, and precious stones. What the Sunday school version leaves out. This was a diplomatic mission between 2 superpowers. Solomon needed her trade routes. She needed to assess whether an alliance made sense. According to Ethiopian tradition, they had a son together, Menelik, who established a dynasty that ruled for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. But here's where the erasure begins. For centuries, European scholars insisted the Queen of Sheba must have been Arab, not African. They couldn't accept that a black woman had the wealth and intelligence to impress Solomon. They twisted geography, ignored Ethiopian historical texts, and created elaborate theories to avoid giving credit where it was due. Because acknowledging that a black African queen ruled one of the ancient world's wealthiest kingdoms, that she was educated enough to challenge Solomon's wisdom, that she negotiated as an equal that would contradict everything they needed people to believe about Africa. Amanirenas, the queen who defeated Rome. 40 BC, the Roman Empire is at its height. Caesar Augustus is expanding in every direction. Rome is supposed to be invincible. And then they meet Amanirenas. Amanirenas ruled Kush, located in what's now Sudan. When Augustus tried to impose taxes on Nubia after conquering Egypt, she gave him an answer he wasn't expecting. She raised 30,000 soldiers, marched north, and destroyed 3 Roman forts. She didn't just defeat the soldiers. She sent a message. She beheaded statues of Augustus and buried his bronze head under temple steps. Rome was furious. They sent 10,000 legionnaires south to crush this rebellion. And then something extraordinary happened. This one-eyed warrior queen fought them to a standstill. For 5 years, she held off the greatest military machine in the ancient world. She used guerrilla tactics, superior knowledge of terrain, and tactical brilliance to make every Roman victory cost more than it was worth. The war became too expensive, too bloody, too difficult. And so Rome, the empire that supposedly never surrendered, did something almost unthinkable. They negotiated. They agreed to exempt Kush from all taxes. They pulled their troops back and let Amanirenas keep her kingdom independent. A black African queen defeated the Roman Empire. Not in legend, not in myth, in documented historical fact. Roman historians wrote about it. Archaeological evidence confirms it. And yet how many history classes teach that Rome lost to a Nubian queen? The story gets buried in footnotes, while Roman victories fill entire chapters. Because acknowledging that a black woman outmaneuvered Roman generals disrupts the entire narrative of Western superiority. The Kandakes, the queens who made Alexander stop. Between 300 BCE and 300 CE, there was a title in Kush, Kandake. In Greek, it became Candace. It meant warrior queen women who ruled independently, commanded armies, made their own decisions without a king telling them what to do. Their reputations were so formidable that conquerors thought twice. When Alexander the Great was sweeping across the known world, conquering everything in his path, he reached the borders of Nubia and stopped. Ancient sources suggest he heard about the Kandakes and their military prowess and decided the fight wasn't worth it. Think about that. Alexander, who conquered from Greece to India, who defeated the Persian Empire, who was called the Great precisely because he seemed unstoppable, looked at Nubia and said, "No, thank you." These queens built pyramids. Yes, Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. Most people don't know that because those pyramids don't fit the narrative. They commanded armies, controlled trade routes, minted currency with their faces on the coins. They corresponded with other rulers as equals. These were women with absolute authority in a world where Greece and Rome insisted only men could rule. And yet, their existence has been minimized, footnoted, erased from popular history. Nzinga, 30 Years of War. 1624, Angola. The Portuguese have arrived in force, hunting for enslaved people to fuel the transatlantic trade. They've just met someone who will make their lives miserable for the next 30 years. Queen Nzinga. When she first met with the Portuguese governor as her brother's ambassador, they deliberately didn't provide her with a chair. It was a power move, forcing her to stand or sit on the floor while the governor sat elevated. Nzinga refused. She gestured to one of her servants, who immediately got on hands and knees. She sat on her servant's back, as if it were a throne, and negotiated the entire treaty from that position. When her brother died and she took power, the Portuguese thought they could manipulate her. They were catastrophically wrong. Nzinga proved to be a military genius. She understood European politics. She played the Portuguese off against the Dutch. She converted to Christianity when politically useful, then renounced it when it wasn't. She offered sanctuary to escaped slaves and runaway soldiers, building her army with people who had every reason to hate the Portuguese. For 30 years, she held them off. 3 decades of warfare where the Portuguese threw everything they had at her and couldn't break her. She personally led troops into battle well into her 60s. When she died at age 80, she died undefeated. And how did history remember her? Portuguese records called her a witch, a savage, a demon. They couldn't admit they'd been fought to a standstill by a black woman, so they demonized her instead. For centuries, her story was either erased or twisted into propaganda about African barbarism. Only recently have historians begun to recognize her for what she actually was, one of the greatest military and political minds of her era. Amina, the warrior who built walls. 1533 to 1610. Northern Nigeria. The Hausa Kingdom of Zaza. Queen Amina came to power when the trans-Saharan trade routes were the highways of African commerce. Salt, gold, ivory, whoever controlled these routes became extraordinarily wealthy. Amina decided she wanted to control them all. She took command of the army and began expanding Zaza's territory. She personally led her troops in a battle, commanding forces of up to 20,000 soldiers. Everywhere she conquered, she built fortified walls around cities. Some still stand today. She ruled for 34 years. Never married because she refused to share power. She rejected every attempt by European traders to establish relationships that would have undermined her authority. Her kingdom became one of the wealthiest in West Africa. And yet, when British colonizers arrived centuries later and heard stories about her, they declared she was probably a myth. African people couldn't possibly have had a queen that powerful, that successful, that militarily brilliant. It must be exaggerated folklore. Never mind the oral histories. Never mind the archaeological evidence. The British needed Africans to seem primitive, uncivilized, incapable of self-governance. A queen like Amina contradicted that story, so they dismissed her as legend, until modern archaeology proved them wrong. The pattern you need to see. Do you see it now? It wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about conquering memory. Because if people know their ancestors built empires, ruled kingdoms, defeated Roman legions, they won't accept being treated as inferior. And so the records had to be destroyed. The libraries of Timbuktu, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, were burned. The gold artifacts proving African metallurgical sophistication were melted down. The stone buildings were attributed to anyone except the Africans who built them. The lie was simple. Africa had no civilization before Europe arrived. Africans built nothing, invented nothing, ruled nothing. This lie justified slavery. This lie justified colonization. This lie justified theft. But here's what they try to bury. When Europeans reached West Africa in the 1400s, they found cities that dazzled them. They found the Mali Empire with wealth that dwarfed medieval Europe. They found Timbuktu with universities older than Oxford. They found Benin with bronze casting so advanced that Europeans couldn't figure out how it was done. They found Mansa Musa, an emperor who gave away so much gold on his pilgrimage to Mecca that he crashed the Mediterranean economy for years. He was literally too rich for the economic systems of his time to handle. And yes, they found these 5 queens and dozens more like them. Women who commanded armies while European women couldn't own property. Women who controlled trade routes while European women were burned as witches for being too educated. Women who built dynasties that lasted longer than most European kingdoms existed. Why this matters now? African civilizations didn't fall because they were primitive. They were systematically destroyed by the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization. Over 400 years, 12 to 15 million Africans were kidnapped. Entire regions were depopulated. Sophisticated political structures were deliberately shattered. And then colonizers pointed at the devastation they'd caused and said, "See, they were never civilized to begin with." The evidence of the lie is everywhere if you know where to look. Ancient Greek historians wrote about learning from African scholars. The Bible references powerful African kingdoms repeatedly. Roman coins show extensive trade with Nubian empires. Medieval Arab scholars wrote detailed accounts of visiting West African kingdoms and being amazed by their wealth. The proof was never hidden. It was just ignored, dismissed, or reinterpreted. Because if people knew that Africa had queens ruling empires while Europe was barely literate, how could you justify colonization? Remember, history is written by conquerors, but the truth survives. It survives in archaeological evidence they couldn't completely destroy. It survives in oral traditions passed down despite every attempt to silence them. It survives in ancient texts that documented these kingdoms before anyone had a political reason to pretend they didn't exist. Erasing a people's past is how you control their future. If you don't know your ancestors built empires, commanded armies, accumulated wealth that made European kings jealous, then you might believe the lie that you're inherently inferior. But resistance is also history. From Amanirenas defeating Rome to Nzinga fighting Portuguese colonizers. From the Kandakes building pyramids to Amina expanding kingdoms. Every generation fought erasure. Every generation preserved truth and passed it forward. Your textbooks lied. These queens ruled the world before Europe even knew that world existed. And remembering them isn't just about correcting history. It's about understanding that the current world order, where European powers dominate, isn't natural or inevitable. It's the result of specific historical processes: violence, theft, erasure. It's a construct, which means it can be challenged and changed. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to a system built on lies is tell the truth. The truth that Africa had civilizations when Europe had villages. The truth that black women ruled empires with authority that made men bow. The truth that African achievement was systematically erased to justify centuries of exploitation. The truth that we carry the legacy of queens. So remember their names. Tell their stories. Refuse to let them be forgotten again. They didn't fight their wars, build their empires, and rule their kingdoms so that their descendants would believe the lies of their conquerors. They did it so we would know, so we would remember, so we would understand that greatness is our inheritance, no matter how many centuries of propaganda say otherwise.